Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes. I'm Richard Vobes, and it's very nice to have your company today. Just getting my audio levels correct. Hopefully that's about right. Hope you're all well. It is the 24th, I think, today of March 2021. Nice to see you out there. All very excited for the next instalment of London Belongs to Me by Norman Collins. We are on part 11, I believe, in our little series. So let's say a few hellos to a few people. Hello to the lovely Julia, to Turbo Stream, who says, at last we have sunshine in the Shire, which is excellent. Sean James Cameron says cloud in London. He's just listening to The Naked Englishman from this morning. Nice to hear the sea in the background. Ah, yes, it was a lovely morning, actually. So I made the most of it. Sean James says, hail is forecast for tomorrow. That's not so exciting. Cooper68 is there. Zom Coco, Billabong O'Neill, Jen Coley, Audrey Forbes, David Vad, John F, and Philip Hammond and Mary. Good afternoon, Richard and Julia. Will be have to catch up later mowing the lawn. Oh, fair enough. I've got a different Mary Hammond jumper on at the moment. You may notice one of my new tank tops. Looks very nice. You going for a full set of matching tank tops, Richard? I've got no, I don't know about a full set. I've got how many have I got now? I've got 2, and then 2 more. So I've got 4. Is that right? Yeah, 2 came in the post before, and then 2 separately. That's right, a green, a red, a yellow, and a teal. That's probably all I need, to be fair. Next, it'll be cardigans and slippers. Anyway, let's not worry about that. We're on book 2, ladies and gentlemen, The Crime on the Common. Oh, the excitement mounts. Lee Lawson has arrived. Hello, Lee, and Michael White. Good to see you. Turbo, Adrian, young Adrian, I've been doing modifications to the van. I don't know whether you'll be approve of them or not approve of them, to be honest with you, but more coming. But that's why I keep picking at my fingernails, because I think I've indented them and now they're itchy. Anyway, Skilt says, what a top. You have my full attention. Excellent. That's what we like to see. Right. So, The Crime on the Common, Chapter 16. It was 6:30 in the evening now. 6:30 on Sunday evening. Percy was getting ready. Up in his room, with the door locked, he was going over all the things he'd be needing. They were spread out on the bed in front of him. There was his knuckle duster, the hedgehog, and a pair of kid gloves that wouldn't leave any fingerprints, and a screwdriver, and a pair of dark glasses that might come in handy, and his cosh, and last of all, there was his bunch of keys. Only fools carry a gun, he said, to console himself for not having one. When he was ready, he put on an old raincoat and scarf, and got down his second-best trilby. It was a soft one with a snap brim that would come right down over his face, if necessary. He hadn't done much all day except dress up. He'd been too jumpy. He started off in his best purple, with a nice brown tie and a pair of neat patents. Then he told himself that there weren't very many of that type of suiting about in London, and what was the use of making yourself an eyeful when you wanted to just be one of the crowd? So he changed into his light check. That was better. A lot of gentlemen wore light checks, especially with summer coming in. But all the same, it was still conspicuous. Not actually an eyeful like the purple, but still conspicuous. And it wasn't what he wanted. So he changed a second time. He was now wearing his old blue pinstripe. That was all right. Half of London wore an old blue pinstripe. As he came out of his room, Mrs. Boone saw him. "Oh, Percy," she said, "not going out?" He sidled past her. "I shan't be long, Mum," he muttered. But tonight, of all nights, when his hands were trembling so much already that he had to keep them behind his back, Mrs. Boone chose to be difficult. "I never have you home, Percy," she said. "You're always going somewhere." "No, I'm not," he said, sullenly, not looking up at her face as he was speaking. "Just wanted to go and get some air." "But what are you wearing those awful clothes for? You look—" "Because I've got to go to the garage that way, that's why," he told her. "Can't a chap take an interest in his job without—" "Oh, all right," Mrs. Boone answered. "But I never know with you, I really don't." And as he went down the stairs, he heard Mrs. Boone asking when he'd be back. But he was too far down to make any reply. Better to pretend he hadn't heard her. Outside, dusk was gathering. There was still some light, but the edges of everything had been blurred, softened. At that moment, Kennington wasn't in brick any longer, it was in crayon. Some of the windows had lights in them, and the interiors looked cosy and inviting. His own window was shining when he glanced back at it. But what caught his eye was a flock of pigeons wheeling round in the sky above Dulcimer Street, catching the declining sun as they turned. Each time their wings were lit up, coral-coloured, for a moment, and then they turned grey again. Percy extended his forefinger like a pistol and pointed at them. "If I had a gun, I'd get one of them. Get the whole lot if I had a gun." But he wasn't being serious, only fooling. He just said it to take his mind off his mother. What right had she to question him? He'd never done her any harm, had he? There he was, setting out to do a job, a hot lift, and he'd been scolded by his mother. It made him look silly. It meant, too, that he couldn't keep his mind on his business. He had to keep reminding himself where he was going. Even when he got on the number 3 bus and booked right through to Crystal Palace, it seemed that this was just some ordinary jaunt that he was out on. It didn't feel different. He didn't feel different from the other people on the bus. But he was different. Voice number 1 reminded him, very different. They hadn't got any ambition. They were just ordinary. They'd stick where they were, while he climbed up. He wouldn't be riding buses much longer. He'd be going about in a car. Not just a lifted car either. His car. When he got to the end of the journey, he looked about for a bit. It was the sort of district that he liked, nice class, with detached villas and neat gardens and little garages. He could just see himself setting up in one of those with Doris. Perhaps they'd join a tennis club. He'd never actually played tennis, but he could learn, couldn't he? All the same, he mustn't start dreaming now. He'd got work to do first. The light was just right for him as he walked along to the Carlton. Not too dark for him to see where he was going, and dark enough for other people not to see him. It was a big new cinema, the Carlton, with a large car park beside it. From the look of the place, there were 100 different cars that he could choose from. He strolled along the opposite side of the road and hung about as though waiting for someone. Nothing out of the ordinary in that. Outside cinema, there's always chaps hanging about for their girls, and in any case, it was essential to the plan. He couldn't afford to pinch a car just when the owner might be coming back to get into it. He wanted a car that had only just been left there, one with the driving seat still warm. Something that would give him a clear 3 hours if it was a long picture before the alarm was raised. So he leant up against the wall and watched. First of all, a small Morris with dented wings came along, keeping very close to the opposite curve as though avoiding him. It turned and made its way into the car park in the same furtive manner, like a cat squeezing into a pantry. Percy let his eyes rest on it for a moment and then looked away again. There'd probably be better later. And sure enough, There was. A natty little Riley, with its radiator all covered in badges and continental touring clubs, drew up at the barrier. Percy ran his tongue across his lips. They were dry. Then he pulled himself together. The Riley was no use to him. It bristled. He wanted something a bit smoother. And while he stood there, along it came. An almost new Austin 12. Like a lamb to the slaughter, he told himself. Like a bleeding lamb to the slaughter. He ran his tongue across his lips again. His heart was thumping now. It's yours, voice number 1 said. Don't do anything silly. Think first and it's yours. Suppose they get you, voice number 2 came. You'd be for it, wouldn't you? But it was too late now to listen to voice number 2. Percy came forward, still keeping in the shadows, to see whereabouts in the car park the Austin was going to be put. And it couldn't have been put better. Its owner went right down to the far end, the dark end, and backed carefully into a vacant space, coming out again once or twice to do the job properly. That's right, Percy thought. Don't scratch it. Leave it all nice for me, like Mother makes it. He watched while 2 people, a man and a woman, got out from the car and went to the cinema, arm in arm. Their heads were close together and they were talking. Give you something real to talk about, he thought. Just you wait till you come out again. The couple came out of the car park by the side entrance and went up to the broad marble steps of the cinema. Percy fell in a few places behind them. They were evidently pretty well-to-do folk. They bought 2 and 6-penny seats. Percy bought the next one and followed them up the stairs. His feet sank into the deep moss-like carpet. The half-crowns were right at the back of the circle, nice seats. Percy would like to have spent the rest of the evening in them. It looked like a good film too, girls dancing and hot trumpeteers and rhythm. But the usherette was trying to put him alongside the couple that he was shadowing, and that would never do. He had got to get outside again, but long before they did. He stood back, and the usherette flashed her torch onto one of the seats in the row behind. That was perfect. Percy sat there, his hat in his lap. He could see what he wanted to see. The head of the Austin owner showed up in the dark like a blob against the lower part of the screen. I'll let them get settled first, he decided. Let them get properly settled, and then I'll leave them here to enjoy themselves. It was hot in the cinema, and his palms, on the palms of his hands, were sticky. He undid his raincoat and watched the whole of the next number right through. It wasn't until the illuminated clock over the exit showed 8:15 that he got up. As he went, he turned and looked over his shoulder. Mr. and Mrs. Austin were snuggled down in their seats as if it was a sofa. Say goodbye to baby, Percy said, under his breath, and ring up the insurance company in the morning. Do you good to have a nice walk? Nobody seemed to notice him as he was leaving the cinema, almost as soon as he had sat down. Why would they? They were all too far interested in the crooner on the screen. And no wonder. He could see every detail of her face. She was about 6 feet across, and every inch of it was pretty. But Percy was taking no notice of it. He was on the job. He was 1 against 10 million. He was a freelance. And he was being careful. He deliberately didn't put his hat on until he was outside. It would have been a mistake to let other people see him wearing it. He wanted to be 2 quite different people now. There was the quiet young man without a hat who had taken himself to the picture and then slipped out again because it was boring. And then there was the young daredevil with the snap-brimmed trilby low over his eyes, who drove stolen cars across the plains of South London. And because he was clever, Percy didn't even leave by the same door. He went right down to the right exit in the front of house. It was the exit leading straight into the car park. During the last 15 minutes, something had happened outside. It was a good deal more dark now. It was slightly foggy. A thin yellow haze had been smeared over everything, and it just suited him. There were no lights in the car park, and a street lamp opposite merely picked out the shadows of the car. Shadows, that was. His little bit of business was best done in the shadows. Beside the exit of the cinema, there was a large notice printed in black letters on white ground. It announced that cars were parked entirely at their owner's risk. Percy grinned when he saw it. That's okay by me, he thought. And what I'm doing is okay by them, so why worry? And his body wasn't as brave as he was. But his body wasn't as brave as he was. He was trembling again, and he was suddenly cold. So cold that he buttoned his coat right up to the neck to protect him. And as he did so, something jumped up against his hip. It was the hedgehog. Now or never, Percy, voice number 1 said to him. This is your chance, chum. The lock in the car door gave him a bit more trouble than he had expected. None of the keys that he'd got were any good for it, and the window was shut fast to keep the flies out. But that didn't stop him. If you couldn't open the car any other way, you just took the handle clean off and the lock came with it. It's easy. He'd got the screwdriver with him and he began using it. All the same, this was the part where he'd have to go carefully. It was one thing to go up to a car and unlock it, and it was something quite different to be seen tinkering. He'd got all the screws loose, and he was just getting ready to do what he'd come for when the exit door of the cinema opened and a couple emerged into the car park. They came straight towards him. For a moment, Percy thought it was Mr. and Mrs. Austin. His mouth went dry. Careful, voice number 1 warned him. Take it easy. Act natural. That was the important thing. To act natural. He thrust his hands into his pockets and began to saunter off. But it wasn't anything. No need to get jumpy. The couple got into a battered little Ford and shot away from the Carlton, as though they were inside a rocket. All they left behind was the smell of oil. Percy went back to his work, though he was still trembling. It was easier now. With a bit of a tug, the lock came away with the handle, and there was nothing between him and what he wanted except a door that hung open on its hinges. So he hesitated a moment before he actually climbed in. He was more nervous than he'd expected, and his mouth kept going dry. It's you I'm doing it for, Doris, darling, he told himself. It's going to be our nest egg. I'm doing it for you. Once inside, it was child's play. He knew all about starters, and this wouldn't be the first time he'd started a car that he'd left the key behind. Everything was in a nice condition, too. The batteries were full, and the engine started almost as soon as he touched it. It was only the door that was a trouble. It was still standing open, as if inviting the whole world to get in after him. But it wasn't the first missing lock that he had known either. He made a wad of newspapers that Mr. Austin had left in the car and jammed the door with it. Now he was ready. Getting past the man at the gate was the first difficulty, but it wasn't a serious one. With his hat pulled down over his eyes, Percy lowered the window a little and held out threepence. The 3p wasn't a guess either. He'd studied how much to give in car parks. More than that might have raised an eyebrow, and less may have led to sarcastic remarks. Threepence was about right. The attendant took it and even went out into the road to see that there was no traffic coming. Percy gave a little salute with his free hand by way of an acknowledgement, and the journey home had begun. Simple, wasn't it? Simple. Now that he'd actually done it, now that he was riding high, he didn't feel nervous any longer. He drove carefully, of course. It was practically a new car, scarcely run in, he should reckon. and he didn't want to spoil it. But he felt quite at home in it. It might have been his for years, and not just the last 5 minutes, and because he was driving slowly, it gave him plenty of time for thought. He drove along, contemplating the future. And this won't be the only one, he told himself. There'll be others too, posh ones, some of them, as soon as I get things organised, Bentleys and Lagondas, and I'll get someone else to do the dirty work on them, keep my hands clean as soon as I get the chance. He was rummaging about the front pocket of the car and found the remains of a cigarette packet that the previous owner had left there, and Percy lit one with a lighter his mother had given him. And I shan't go lifting cars once I'm married. Not when I've got Doris, he continued. I'll be on the level then. I'll run my own garage and do high-class hire work on the side and have a second-hand department. I'll be a Morris agent. I'll sell car insurance. I'll have a hydraulic jack and some hot air for drying. I'll do repairs and reboring. I'll charge 'em plenty. I shan't go on lifting cars after I'm married, not when I've got Doris. He was in a stream of traffic by now. He couldn't drive fast even if he wanted to, but it didn't matter. 25 miles an hour was good enough for him. And in any case, this was where he turned off. This was the road that led towards Wimbledon. Wimbledon was important. He'd got it all figured out. Supposing some chap was lifting some car from somewhere to take it to some place, wouldn't you expect him to start off almost in the opposite direction? Would you expect him? No, of course you wouldn't. Not unless you were screwy. And suppose some cop saw you driving in the opposite direction and remembered you, and suppose things got hot afterwards and they started asking you questions, and you could prove it wasn't you because you weren't going your way, see? But Percy's mind wasn't on coppers for the moment. It was on pleasanter things. Or I might get clean out of the garage line altogether, he promised himself. Build sports cars, Boone specials, and race 'em. Have my own team. Pick up some of them fat prizes and put Boone specials on the market. Yeah, I might get clean out of the garage line. Then a more tender and sentimental mood came over him. My little darling, he thought, you're my destiny. You're my girl of the dreams. You'll look all right in furs. You'll walk beside me. You'll have a dressing table with a glass top. You dwell in my secret heart. You'll use scent I choose for. You're my destiny, my little darling. He could almost feel her sitting there in the seat next to him. He'd only have to lift his hand off the gear lever for it to rest on her knee. The silk stocking would give a little squeaky thrill as he drove. Oh, cripes, he thought, suddenly. Let her like me a bit. I'm not good enough for her, but let her like me. As he was getting into Wimbledon by now, and so far there hadn't been a single hitch, everything had worked out exactly according to plan, and in consequence he was feeling better. Cool as ice, that's me, he told himself. Trust Percy. Just in front of him stood the Duke of Marlborough. It was at a crossroads, and from the way it dominated the place, it might have been the civic centre of those parts. It was flood-lit to show up the modern Tudor beams, and in the flagged courtyard there were cars parked in a double row. A space in the front one gave him an idea. It wasn't 9 yet, and the big film, wouldn't be over till 10:30. He'd got all the time he could want. So, waving on the rest of the traffic, he turned into the courtyard. He was just in time to capture the empty parking place from a thirsty little hillman that came sneaking up. Inside the Duke of Marlborough, it was pretty high class. Percy liked the lounge. It was a large, impressive sort of room with light oak panels and lots of little separate tables with green leather chairs. The decorations were high class too. There were long velvet curtains that might have come off a stage and some nice pieces of china on the shelf running along the wall. The whole place had just been rebuilt, which was why everything was so new and fresh looking, even the old parts. The antique copper jugs that hung in a row over the bar were brand new, every one of them. And even the stag's head that was mounted over the door was bright and glossy, as though it had just been shot specially for the opening. The lounge was full tonight because it was Sunday, and it was hot, almost as hot as the cinema, and noisy. Between 60 and 70 people were crushed in there, all talking at the tops of their voices. Above the noises they made was the constant clink of glasses, the rattle of the cash register, madly recording the shillings and pennies, and the tinkle of the small bell like a fire alarm in a doll's house as somebody scored a lucky shot on one of the pin tables. Business was certainly brisk, and change was being passed over the counter in wet handfuls. It was some time before Percy could get served, and in the interval of waiting he changed his mind several times. Originally he just meant to order a bitter, then he thought of a Guinness, then a whisky and soda. Finally the man in front had ordered a large pink gin, and Percy asked for the same. It might be far better if he stuck to a bitter, but of course he wasn't to know that at the time, and because the pink gin seemed just what he needed. "I've earned it, ain't I? I've earned it," he asked himself. "I'm only human, ain't I?" He made his way back to the bar a second time and ordered himself a second one. It was about 9:15 now, and after he'd finished it he decided he may as well be going. No hurry, you understand, just getting the job over and done with. He couldn't get out immediately, however. The party at the table behind him was just breaking up, and the man with the crushed-in sports hat and roll-top pullover was just leaving. "Ta-da!" he said to the girl at the table. "You'll be hearing from me." "Ta-da!" the girl answered. Percy found himself looking at the girl, and suddenly he realised who he was looking at. It was the blonde. At the same moment the blonde looked up and saw him. "Hello, Percy," she said, smiling at him under her eyelashes. "Fancy meeting you here." He paused. The blonde stroked the empty chair beside her. "Come and sit down," she said. He took a step, but no more, in her direction. Just going," he told her. "Why, what's the hurry?" "Nothing," he replied, grudgingly. That was just the point. He couldn't admit that there was a hurry. "Well, come on then." He came over and sat down on the extreme edge of the green leather cushion. It was obvious she didn't mean to stop. It was obvious that he didn't mean to stop long. "You are matey," she said. Over by the door, the man in the crushed sports hat turned and waved. Percy just caught a glimpse of him and he was gone. He envied him being able to walk out like that. "Aren't you drinking anything?" the blonde went on. "Finished," Percy told her. "I was just going when I saw you." "Well, have another one with me," she invited him. "A short one. Then I'll be going along too." He thought rapidly, going over all the possibilities in his mind. He needed time to figure things out. It was no use simply standing there. "OK," he said feebly. "What's yours?" "Same as before," she said. "Gin and orange." When he got back, the blonde moved her chair, closer to his. She let her hand droop down so that he could hold it. "Going straight back?" she asked him. "No," he said. "I've got to go to Victoria." The blonde pouted. "I thought perhaps you might have dropped in to see me if you felt that way," she told him. "But it doesn't matter." Percy felt his heart begin to thump as she said it. He forgot all about Doris for the moment, but he was careful. He wasn't going to let himself go to pieces just because he'd been invited. No good tonight," he said. "I'm delivering a car for someone." The blonde pouted again and clearly didn't believe him. Percy was angry. Now he'd got over the invitation, he wanted to be going. "It's parked outside in the car park." But the blonde wasn't giving anything away. "Well, you could drop me on the way," she said. "I didn't mean anything. Just thought you might like to." This was worse. She looked more of a blonde than ever tonight. She had her hair done, and her head was covered in a thick, fancy little work of yellow curls. If a policeman saw her in the tram car, he'd guess she'd stolen it. Not supposed to in customers' cars," he blurted out. Then the blonde got up stage. "Oh, of course, if you don't want to, it's different. Sorry I spoke. If you don't want to be seen with me..." This was better. This wasn't any better either. The last thing he wanted to do was to have her think that he was keeping anything from her, so he grinned politely. "I'll risk it," he told her. "Only get hanged once." "That's more like it," she said. She was smiling again now. As soon as he got outside, he realised that the worst had happened. Those 3 gins had been 1 gin too many, and he was muzzy. Not badly muzzy, just not swaying or indistinct or anything like that, but definitely not his best. "I've got to go carefully," he told himself. "I've got to mind my step. I've got to go carefully." And a silly thought came to him. Suppose I get back in... Suppose when I get back to it, the Austin isn't there. Suppose somebody's pinched it. Suppose it isn't there. But it was there all right. Over £200 worth of it. The blonde made her way round to the far door, but Percy stopped her. That door's jammed," he said. "You slide over." When the blonde had settled herself in, Percy slammed his door after her. Then he began fiddling about under the dashboard because he'd disconnected the starter. "Want a hairpin?" the blonde asked. Percy shook his head. "No, it's okay," he said. "This is a repair job, this." Because he was afraid that he was muzzier than he really was, he was clumsy. He made a mess of getting out of the courtyard. His rear bumper got under somebody else's mudguard, and it made a noise like a tin bath tearing. The blonde gave a little titter. "That's another repair job," she said. But nobody paid much attention, and Percy didn't trouble to get out and investigate. He didn't want to get drawn into a long argument because he hadn't got time. It was too bad for someone. When he got the nose of the car out into the main road, he looked carefully both ways before edging into the traffic. The little incident of the mudguard had rather unnerved him. The blonde noticed this. "Why don't you have L on the front?" she asked him. "Not my car," Percy told her. "That's why I'm being careful with it." "Do you mean you've pinched it?" she inquired. She was lighting a cigarette as she was speaking, and when it was lit she passed it over to Percy. He took it from her without saying anything, and, as he raised it to his lips, he noticed the broad band of lipstick around the butt. Because he was thinking of Doris at that moment, the sight of the wet red cigarette that the blonde had handed over disgusted him, and he wanted to throw it away. The fog had thickened by now. It was damp and clinging. He started up the windscreen wipers. "If I hit anyone, I'm finished," he kept saying to himself. "One tap and I'm out. A ruddy dog'll be enough, but if I hit anyone, I'm finished." "You talking to me?" the blonde asked, and Percy realised that he'd been saying those things out loud. He shook his head and drove more carefully than ever. He was just saying things out. If he was saying things out loud, it showed that he must be really muzzy and not just imagining it. They'd reached the outskirts of the common by now, and the silver birches showed up in the headlamps of the car. "This is where I can let her out," he told himself. "This is where I begin to drive." The needle of the speedometer started to swing round. 35, that was more like it. 40, 45. It didn't matter to him if the car hadn't been run in yet. He wasn't going to keep it, was he? Besides, this was the authentic thrill of motoring. Nearly 50, real open road stuff. Over 50 wouldn't be safe in this fog. Over 50 wouldn't be safe with this fog about. "Look where you're going," the blonde advised him. "You got me in the car, remember?" Percy started. She'd been quite right to warn him. He'd simply been driving with his eyes fixed on the speedometer. He hadn't been looking at the road at all, so he stiffened up in his seat and stared grimly out through the windscreen. When he saw what the blonde had really warned, he saw what the blonde had really warned him about. Right in front of him, only 50 yards or so, stood a policeman, and he was flashing his torch at him. Dot, 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 a little beam of light went. Percy felt his jaw drop. Then it tightened again. So, they'd got to him, had they? Somebody had put the word out. They were after him. Well, they weren't going to get him. Not a chance. If they wanted him, they'd have to come straight for him. He pressed his foot down on the accelerator and drove past. Drove straight on. "You gone crackers?" the blonde said. "He's trying to stop you. There's been an accident or something." An accident? He didn't really hear the words until he was right on top of it, and by then there'd very nearly been another accident. All he saw was a man lying stretched out flat on the side of the road with his collar open and two ends sticking up, and his hat was all smashed in, lying beside him. That and the policeman jumping to one side as Percy and the blonde shot past him. He felt sick when he realised that he'd nearly killed a policeman. Supposing he had? It was bad enough the way things were, wasn't it? The cop was bound to report what had happened. He might even get the patrol out. But then Percy would be in the gravy, all right. Then he'd have something to think about. As it was, the blonde was behaving queerly. Under that hard exterior, she'd got no nerves at all. She was screaming at him to stop. "Let me out," she was saying. "I don't like it. Let me out." "Shut your trap," he told her. "You get out when I say so." He was still driving fast, and the fog, or mist, or whatever it was thicker. He turned his headlamps off. The fog was hitting back at him, and he didn't want to go about without a bleeding halo round him. They would be after him now, for sure. "Let me out!" The blonde was crawling at him by now, and the time for politeness was over. "If you don't shut up, I'll make you." "You try." She caught hold of his collar and pulled. She got her fingers down inside his neck. She was throttling him. Just as the stud broke and the collar went loose, and he got his hand free and he shoved it in her face, and the car gave a nasty swerve as he did so, but it taught the blonde a lesson. She started whimpering. Then, suddenly in front of her in the dashboard pocket with the cigarettes, she saw a spanner. This was a large one with a head like a battle axe. She grabbed at it and held it over him. "Now will you let me out?" It was the sort of moment Percy had read about, when everything depended on keeping calm. "All right," he said. "Do it. Then we'll both be killed." He accelerated again as he said it. He knew she'd never dare, but at the last moment, just as she hit him, he knew that she was going to. His left hand helped to soften the blow. Even so, the spanner went right down into his hat. It hurt, and because it hurt, he forgot Number One had always told him about what Number One had told him about keeping cool. Driving with one hand, he wrenched the spanner from her and hit back. She was trying to stop him, wasn't she? It's all very tense. And he got her all right. He felt the jar run up his arm as the sharp end of the spanner caught her. She simply folded away from him, and that was the end of her. She fell back against the door, and the little wad of paper came out. The door swung open, and a moment later, Percy was in the car alone. This time he didn't care who was following him. He just jammed the brakes on and brought the car up, rocking. There they were, nearly 20 feet of skid marks in the road behind him, and almost lost in the mist, the blonde was lying all doubled up as she had fallen. He started to run back. When he got to her, it surprised him to find what a long way it was. He saw that she must have rolled over and over when she hit the road. Everything on her was torn. What was worse is the way that she was lying. Her head was twisted right back, and she was looking up at him. Looking up at him with a dirty, lifeless face down with a thick, dark caterpillar of blood which was crawling. "I'm getting out of this," Percy told himself. "I don't like it. I'm getting out of this." That's what it was like on the spot. But coming up a bit higher... Oh, hang on. I'm just getting the measure of this. That's what it was like on the spot. But come up a bit higher, get an angel's view, as it were. What's it like now? Well, travelling across the south, the red foothills of Surbiton give the place a grey... Hang on. Travelling across the south, the red foothills of Surbiton give the place to the grey brick forests of Wimbledon, and then, like the primitive jungle itself, criss-crossed with the track, the common, Wimbledon Common, comes right up against habitation. There are no outposts, it's simply there. You can't see much of it because of the mist. It's only in patches that the ground is showing, and in one of these patches where the road is gleaming, a crowd is gathered. It's quite a big crowd with 2 policemen and 2 white ambulances. The ambulance is for the blonde, though she doesn't know it, and they've put a blanket over her. Then the crowd divides because there is something coming. It's a police car. The police car stops and 3 men in raincoats get out. The 4th continues to sit there in the back with his earphones on. The others say something to him and begin to move off across the bracken to where an abandoned car is standing with its lights still on. Silly, wasn't it, of Percy to leave the lights on? But he couldn't really be blamed. He'd lost his nerve by then and wasn't responsible. Further over in the bushes, a policeman has found Percy's snap-brim trilby. Further over among the bushes, a policeman who has found Percy's snap-brim trilby is blowing his whistle. Coming out of the darkness, the policeman's whistle sounds like some melancholy nightbird. Is there anything else of interest to report? No. Everything else is lonely and peaceful. It might have been primeval England, that bit of common, until you come right up to the northwest corner of the common, almost in Putney. Then there's something. It's the figure of a man. He's running, darting from tree to tree, seeking cover all the way. He's milky pale, and down his face the sweat is coursing. He hasn't noticed there's blood on his collar, but there is. The blonde splashed it over him when he hit her. And while he runs, he keeps muttering something to himself. It's indistinct because he's out of breath, but it sounds like this. "Oh, Mum, I didn't mean to. I never meant to hurt her. I didn't mean it, Mum." Percy is in real trouble now. He is. He is in trouble. Dear oh, dear oh, dear oh, law. Percy has just killed this girl. Dear oh dear. We are at 22 the hour. So much excitement. Sorry I didn't read it very well. We're on chapter 17. It was just a week later. Sunday had come round again, and Sunday is always a good time to find people at home. Over the studio flat in Adelaide Road, Doreen was sitting up in bed reading the paper and drinking a cup of tea that Doris had made for her. It was a bright, sparkling kind of morning. There had been rain in the night, but now the sun was shining, and all the surrounding rooftops, there was a good view from all of these, looked as clean and as fresh as though they'd been scrubbed as well as drenched. Doris was sitting on the other end of Doreen's bed, drinking a cup of tea herself and smoking a cigarette. There was something pleasantly idle and luxurious about it. Because it was Sunday, it wouldn't matter if they just messed about in their dressing gowns for half the morning, and then have a sort of combined meal later, half breakfast, half lunch. It was, in fact, exactly such a morning as this that she and Doreen had set up the house together. Because Doreen had been the one to grab the paper, she was the first to see the headlines about the dead girl on Wimbledon Common. She adored all crime. She'd started to read automatically, but there wasn't many details to go on. It was too early for that. The headlines, in fact, were the best part. Trousered blonde dead by stolen car, they ran. And below them, in smaller type, motor bandit death ride. The news of this affair was really very scanty. All it said was there was a blonde whose coloured toenails and expensive head injuries... Sorry, not expensive. All it said was that a blonde with coloured toenails and extensive head injuries had been found dead close beside an abandoned car belonging to a Crystal Palace accountant. The car, which had been stolen less than 2 hours before the occurrence of the crime, had been identified by PC Grubb, inset, the picture presumably, as the vehicle which had been driven head-on at him while he had signalled it to stop. The police had removed the stolen car on a lorry so they could examine it for fingerprints. Fingerprints? Doreen curled up her toes as she read. The word always gave her a delicious little shudder. She was very comfortable, and this was really the ideal way to enjoy crime. It had always seemed a funny thing to her, the way there were two kinds of people in the world, those who went about murdering and getting murdered, and those who just liked to read about it. She had, however, read so much about crime that she was sure, absolutely sure, that she knew exactly how murderers must feel after they've killed someone. Sooner or later, if she could find someone to go with, she meant to go to the Old Bailey sometime and sit right through a murder trial. She'd never actually seen a murderer. She looked up for a moment. "Doris, my lamb," she said, "do be an angel and give me another cigarette. I wasn't going to, but yours smells so divine, I simply must." Back in Dulcimer Street, Sunday morning was proceeding very much as usual. Starting from the top flat, Mr. Puddy was doing quite nicely in a quiet bachelor sort of way. He just finished a piece of Best End haddock and was going on to the bread and butter and marmalade. The only thing that rankled was that there hadn't been enough haddock, or at least not so much as he had expected. He'd chosen the bit of fish himself, chosen it carefully, and they couldn't have given him the bit he picked, because his bit he picked was nearly twice that size. There was only one other thing that was wrong. Because the haddock had been rather on the salt side, tasty but decidedly salty, it meant that Mr. Puddy kept on wanting cups of tea. He had to go over to the gas ring twice for more hot water, and all that jumping up and down wasn't doing him any good. He couldn't digest it properly without moving. Mr. Puddy read about the girl on Wimbledon Common too. He sucked his teeth in when he read it, and wondered if PC Grubb was any relation to the man who had once been with him in the milk round business. But he didn't linger over the case. There was nothing particularly interesting about it, so far as he could see, nothing that made it stand out. Now, if the policeman had been fired at, for instance, Or if the dead girl had been inside the car, and if the bandit had set the car on fire. As it was, Mr. Puddy's thoughts reverted to the fishmonger and what he was going to say to him. Down below, Connie was already up and about. She wasn't looking her best at the moment. She hadn't dressed yet, or washed, or done her hair. With last night's makeup still on, she had the look of a battered, rather dissipated doll. She was clad only in her dressing gown and her swansdown bedroom slippers, but she was busy all right. She was doing a letter. She was, a very important one, and it wasn't easy. The sixpenny pad from Woolworths, the Goldonia, was half used up already and nothing to show for it. This was going to be her last attempt, and if it didn't come out right this time, she decided to chuck the whole thing in and try again. But everything was now ready for the last attempt. She'd cleaned the nib and drawn half a dozen faint lines in pencil to keep the writing straight. The letter was addressed to the Secretary of Actors and Actresses Benevolent Fund. "Dear Sir or Madam," it began, "like so many members of our profession, I've fallen upon evil times, owing to me having been in the club business prior to our licence going. I've lost most of my old stage connections, and I'm too short for the films. I'm now entirely without funds, and the rent keeps coming round as usual. Anything that your society could do in the way of a small pension or loan, or put me in touch with someone with a view to an engagement, either backstage or cloaks, would be gratefully appreciated by yours truly, Connie Coke. P.S. The play's the thing." She sat back and read the letter over. Nothing had gone wrong this time, and what she had written was about as good as she could hope to get it. There was an envelope already addressed, and Connie folded the letter, kissed it, and popped it inside. Then she got up and poured into her hand a little heap of crumbs from the paper bag that contained biscuits. "It's in the lap of the gods now, little Dukey boy," she said. And taking a mouthful of the broken biscuits, she pressed her face up against the cage so that Duke could peck the crumbs one by one out of her pursed lips. In the Boones' front room, everything was still very quiet. Mrs. Boone had been up early as usual and had gone round to St. Joseph's for 8 o'clock mass. It was silent and detached and peaceful, and at the same time snug inside St. Joseph's. Those 35 minutes on Sundays were like a rest cure. They did her real good. It was funny the way just going round the corner for half an hour before most people were up could make you feel calm and contented for all the rest of the week. And it was a pity that Percy was too tired to come with her these days. But he was all in by Sundays. She was back now and had taken Percy's morning cuppa into him. That had been nearly an hour ago, and there was still no sign of him. It seemed to Mrs. Boone that the garage worked Percy too hard, and those odd jobs they gave him, like Sunday night, he'd been worn out by the time he got home. She was worried about him. She didn't like to start breakfast without him because that would destroy all the cosy feeling of Sunday morning. Besides, Percy didn't like it either that way. That was because they were such chums, her and Percy. He wasn't like a son the way he went on. He was more like a husband, really, and always thinking of her in his own way. There had been that lovely blue rug he'd given her. It had made her feet tingle just touching it in the mornings. And only on Thursday he'd talked about a holiday for her that summer. Somewhere good, like Clacton, he'd said. Book up at a boarding house. Have someone to wait on you for a bit. And he'd said that he would try and get hold of a car to run her down. It was just too lovely to think about. So lovely that perhaps it was wicked. In any case, she was sure it wouldn't come true. Percy would be too busy, or he'd forget, or something. All the same, she kept on thinking. She couldn't help it. It was wonderful to think of 4 square meals a day appearing punctually on a table without having to cook any of them. She glanced at the clock. It was after 10 now. Percy was later than usual. She put out her hand and felt the teapot. Cold. Very nearly stone cold. But that was her own fault. She'd heard a sound earlier and thought that was Percy dressing, and so she'd made the cup of tea without calling through to ask if he was ready. Of course, as soon as Percy showed up, she'd have to make a fresh pot. He couldn't be expected to drink stuff like that, and he'd probably want some fresh bacon as well. It would have to be a new brew after breakfast, in fact. While she was sitting there, she poured herself a cup of tea. While she was sitting there, she poured herself out a cup of the dark, tepid brew that had been quietly stewing, and drank it quite furtively. She didn't want Percy to catch her at all. It would have looked greedy, not waiting. At Clacton, too, there had been pleasure cruises and char-a-banc trips, round the lighthouse and mystery tours of East Anglia, and 20 or 30 happy, carefree mothers. Perhaps she could persuade Percy to come with her on one of those. Only Percy hadn't said anything about going to Clacton himself, only about sending her there. Well, I'm going to stop there because they're just running through all the different people on the Sunday morning, and it's still a way to the end of the chapter. But there's a natural pause there, so I'm going to have a natural pause there if that's all right with you. Basically, Percy's murdered the blonde who he met in the amusement arcade some weeks earlier. He's done a runner. He's been at home. Presumably he's gone back to work for the week because this is a week later, and he's not come down to see Mrs. Boone. Meanwhile, everybody else seems to be reading about this strange murder on the common. So there we go. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Thank you very much for joining me. I will catch up with you. What's today? Wednesday. Catch up with you tomorrow. It's Thursday tomorrow, isn't it? Yes. So brilliant stuff. And sorry to keep you right up to the hour, but that seemed to be the only sensible place to stop. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. There is the Vobes show tonight. I don't know what's happening on that, but we will see. So take care, one and all. Hope you had a good time, and ta-ta for now. Bye-bye.